You really just pushed my twin babies into the pool, and now you're saying it's not a big deal? Verla Drench didn't even flinch. She adjusted the laminated badge around her neck, the one that read Briarwatch Hollow Preservation League, Board President, and muttered, "You should have followed the guidelines. That deck is closed to flotation devices and minor dependents under 5. My daughters, 2 years old, still wheezing in their therapy rings, were sobbing in my arms. I jumped in 6 seconds after the splash. The only reason they hadn't gone under was because Mira sewed emergency back float mesh into those rings the day before she died. Verla didn't care. Her windbreaker didn't even ripple. I lifted my eyes to the blinking camera on the pool house roof. "That sensor," I said, "still pings back to my server. Verla, I wrote the firmware it runs on." She finally looked unsure, just for a second. Then she turned her back and walked toward the gate like she hadn't just tried to drown the only family I have left. If your HOA president thinks a laminated rulebook gives her the right to endanger children, especially in the name of community visuals, go ahead and hit subscribe right now. Because this isn't just another neighborhood horror story. This one ends with 15 Navy SEALs walking through that same gate before the chlorine dried from her hands. My name is Commander Soren Maddox. I served 18 years as a Naval Special Warfare Intelligence Officer, assigned to trauma-based engagement environments and military family risk stabilization. I don't throw titles around, but this one matters. I hold Level 4 disaster psychology clearance for family endangerment cases. I also hold full custody of 2 daughters born 7 weeks premature during a respiratory failure sequence Mira didn't survive. She died holding one of their wrists. The day before her last breath, she stitched camo-themed twin float rings and called them survivor wings. Said they were for their first swim on their own terms. She didn't mean without her. We moved to Briarwatch Hollow last year, private lake, fenced pool, supposedly a safe place for veteran families and kids. Mira would have loved the clover deck, whitewood planks, just enough sun for an hour outside, no traffic noise. It became our memory ground, our peace. Then Verla Drench declared it a visual serenity zone. No float rings, no toddlers, no unauthorized symbols of grief or personalization. That's what she called the wings, unauthorized personalization. I filed for ADA exemption anyway, citing pediatric trauma accommodation laws. Attached the therapist's signature, cited the state code. Verla returned it with 2 words: visually disruptive. So I kept using the rings. I knew she'd retaliate. I didn't know it would happen with this much intent. She waited until I looked away, just long enough to open the towel bag. The sound was too loud to mistake. The scrape of her shoe against the deck. Then the splash. I turned fast, saw the rings spinning. One of the twins had slipped partially out, drifting toward the suction port. If I had been even 3 seconds slower, there's a moment between instinct and impact where your mind rewires. For me, it was seeing the glint of Verla's HOA badge swaying as she stepped back. That was the moment I knew this wasn't neglect. This was sabotage. I didn't shout, didn't threaten. Just swam to my kids, lifted both into my arms, and let the chemical burn of the water settle on my skin, while their cries pierced the surface. The camera above was still on. 3 neighbors stood frozen at the fence, one already dialing 911. Another took a photo, but I didn't look at them. I opened the waterproof pouch strapped to my hip. Inside was the protocol pack, drive, timestamp token, and laminated access credential to the Vigilant Tide Civilian Response Network. It activates only in post-bereavement emergencies involving children. Mira qualified us 2 months before she passed. Verla had no idea what she'd triggered. 15 operators, ex-naval trauma extraction specialists, were stationed just 4 miles away. And while Verla Drench was walking off that deck like nothing happened, I was already syncing my footage and prepping to end her HOA career before sunset. The pool incident didn't happen in isolation. Verla Drench's war against my family started slow, like rot behind drywall. You don't see it at first, just a smell in the air, a shift in tone. Then one day, everything caves in. 3 weeks before she pushed my twins off that deck, she left a citation envelope wedged into the cedar frame of our front door. It was hand-delivered, no postage, no timestamp. Just a photocopied infraction with a sticky note. Visual disruption. Flotation devices and toddler noise complaints. Review Section 4G. I stood on the porch holding that paper in one hand and the float rings in the other. The girls were inside, napping, sun-drunk and soothed. The float rings Mira had made were still damp from the lake, and the tread marks from their stroller tires were faint on the deck planks. We'd followed every posted rule. Still, the warning sat there like a threat written in legal ink. Section 4G wasn't about safety. It was about preserving neighborhood tranquility through noise management and uniform aesthetics. Verla used it like a sword. If your wreath was the wrong color, 4G. If your dog barked once after 6 p.m., 4G. If your child screamed during play, violation. But until she set her eyes on my girls, most neighbors just laughed it off. Then came the pattern. First, she removed the benches around the shallow end, claiming they attracted unregulated family clustering. Then she filed a proposal to limit pool access to residents over the age of 5 during high traffic hours. Then she installed the sign on the clover deck. Quiet zone, adult residents only, no floating objects, no wet diapers, no exceptions. I appealed every change. My appeal to the board was professional, not emotional. I attached a pediatric trauma therapy recommendation letter, a written evaluation from the base hospital's Family Services Division, and a federal memo from the Gold Star Survivors Council highlighting the value of outdoor exposure and water therapy for bereaved military children. Verla responded with silence. 2 days later, another violation showed up, this one citing unauthorized personalization of therapeutic equipment, the rings. Mira's rings. Apparently, camouflage fabric counted as military branding, which the HOA classified as visual marketing. When I requested a hearing to challenge the citation, Verla delayed it by claiming the HOA had no duty to review exceptions submitted on personal emotional grounds. She said that out loud, on record, in front of 4 board members and 2 other residents. One of them shifted uncomfortably, the other just lowered her gaze. I'd spent most of my adult life reading body language. I saw it for what it was: submission, fear. The board wasn't loyal to her. They were afraid of being targeted next. 1 week before the push, Verla stood in front of the clover deck with a measuring tape, snapping photos. She waved at my girls like they were stray dogs. When I stepped out to ask what she was doing, she said, "The visual lines from the clubhouse are disrupted. People don't want to see grief while they swim." That was when I knew something deeper was broken in her. I've encountered trauma denial before, seen men dismantle entire units just to avoid dealing with one buried memory. But Verla wasn't hiding from her own grief. She was trying to erase mine, and she was using the HOA charter as the mechanism. The neighbors began to split. Some stayed silent, hoping the whole thing would blow over. But a few started to notice what was happening, how she cornered my daughters as symbols of rule breaking, how she documented every harmless moment like it was criminal. I caught her taking photos from her upstairs window while we played in the front yard. One of the kids tripped on her shoelace and cried. The next day, I got a noise complaint. All of it was building towards something. I could feel it tightening, like the seconds before a breach. The pattern of escalation was textbook. My job used to be spotting threats before they went kinetic. She wasn't just targeting my family. She was waiting for a moment, the moment. And then, on a bright Thursday afternoon, she found it. I found Dr. Ellis Ventro leaning against his SUV with a closed expression and crossed arms, as if he hadn't been 5 steps away when my daughters hit the water. His stethoscope was still looped on his rearview mirror, same black windbreaker every board member wore, though his looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. He didn't say anything at first. "You saw it," I said. His jaw tightened. Then he gave the smallest nod. "I was on the curb. I didn't realize." She walked up. She pushed them. There was no ambiguity. His eyes flicked to the pool deck, now roped off in yellow caution tape by the first officer on scene. Verla said the float was unsecured. She lifted it, I said, with both babies strapped in. And she's still walking around like she's untouchable. Ellis exhaled slowly. She's been escalating, quietly. Policy memos, meeting reschedules, consolidating vote powers when no one was watching. It was subtle, until today. That wasn't confession. It was fear trying to pass for reason. I didn't press. Not yet. Ellis had been part of the original HOA election slate, one of the technical voices, supposedly neutral. He worked trauma intake at the Naval Hospital, saw all the worst case families, heard stories you didn't repeat over dinner. That's why I couldn't understand how someone like him had stayed silent while Verla weaponized policy against mine. I need your board notes, I said. The original ones, before she started redlining the minutes. His jaw twitched. They're not all digital anymore. I stepped back. Then meet me at the diner off Rillstone, tomorrow morning. Bring whatever she hasn't touched. He didn't confirm, but he didn't say no either. By the time I got home, my daughters were sleeping. Both clutched their wet float rings like anchors. I toweled their hair dry again, even though it already was. Habit. My hands didn't stop moving even after I'd finished. I sat on the porch watching the sun slip behind the tree line. In the stillness, I thought about Mira. She'd warned me once, months before the accident, about the way authority mutates in small spaces. It's never about the rule, she said. It's about who gets to enforce it. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I arrived at the diner 15 minutes early. I took the far booth, back against the wall, full view of the exit and the counter. Old habits. The waitress poured me coffee without asking, like she'd done the last 6 Sundays since we moved in. Ellis walked in 7 minutes late. He didn't sit right away, just stood there for a second, fingers curling the edge of a manila folder until it bent. She threatened to remove me from the board, he said. Said if I didn't back the quiet initiative clause, she'd cite me for dereliction. She's been drafting resolutions without meetings, using executive clauses to bypass vote cycles. I stayed quiet because I thought I could influence it from the inside. Then yesterday happened. He nodded, set the folder down. This has everything she's edited, every memo she blocked, photos I took of her red marking proposals behind closed doors, and something else, copies of pool zoning maps. She had the fence, order submitted before she filed for HOA reimbursement. That's grounds for procedural fraud. I opened the folder and flipped through each sheet, mentally cataloging every timestamp, every red pen note, every discrepancy between her claims and reality. It wasn't just obstruction, it was documentation of intent. Ellis tapped the final page. I never thought she'd go that far with kids, but I also didn't stop her. That's on me. His voice cracked a little when he said it, just enough to be human. Testimony matters, I said, especially yours. He nodded once. You're planning escalation. I didn't answer. He already knew. When he stood to leave, he paused. I'll back any formal complaint. You're not the only one she's threatened. You're just the first to push back. I sat in that booth alone for another 30 minutes, rereading every note, every photo, every memo, until my pulse steadied. The truth wasn't buried. It was documented by her own allies. The warning letter arrived less than 24 hours after Ellis handed over the folder, hand-delivered again. Same generic font, same HOA masthead. But this one wasn't a citation. It was a notice of temporary suspension from all community access facilities, effective immediately. Violation cited: negligent supervision of minor dependents resulting in emergency disruption of pool operations. That was her angle. Verla Drench was doubling down. She wasn't retreating. She was framing. I stood on the porch rereading the letter as my daughters played quietly in the living room, stacking their float rings like building blocks. The bruises from the pool wall were still faint on their forearms. I knew what Verla was doing. Not just reputation damage. She was laying groundwork, building a paper trail to suggest I was the hazard, not her. If the community accepted it, if she documented it well enough, she could argue I was the unstable one. And if she pulled it off, she'd be able to escalate even further. HOA-backed calls to child services, restraining actions, even custody complaints. I'd seen versions of this tactic overseas, not with HOAs, with proxy forces who used bureaucracy like barbed wire, paperwork designed to choke you slow. Verla was a different breed, but the architecture of control was the same. By afternoon, the signs went up. White corrugated plastic with glossy black text. Community facilities under review, restricted to adult access pending investigation. No mention of names, no mention of the incident. But the message was clear. The pool, the clubhouse, the lake trail. Every shared space was now off limits, and neighbors started whispering. They didn't ask what had happened. They asked why I'd been banned. I needed more than Ellis's word. That night, I pulled up the HOA's public archive on the municipal compliance server. Buried under property tax disclosures and waterline updates, I found the resolution logs. Verla had uploaded 2 amendments in the last 30 days. One modifying the quorum thresholds for emergency voting, and one allowing the HOA president to execute temporary safety enforcements without immediate board consensus. Both had been time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. That was illegal under the charter. All amendments required live session majority, recorded votes, and daytime scheduling. The system didn't lie, but Verla had uploaded them anyway. Either she thought no one would look, or she thought no one would dare to challenge it. She was about to find out how wrong she was. I documented everything: screenshots, backups, file hashes, time zones, IP origin markers. I didn't need a smoking gun. I needed a procedural failure traceable to a named administrator, and she'd given it to me freely, time-stamped like a signature. When I shut the laptop, the house was quiet. I stepped into the twins' room and watched them sleep, curled in opposite corners of their crib like mirror images. Mira used to say they were one soul split into 2 bodies. I always thought it sounded poetic. Now it sounded tactical. The next morning, I met with my contact at Vigilant Tide. The office wasn't marked, just a low-roof stone building 4 miles from Briarwatch, tucked behind a bait shop and a shuttered veterans post. Tearsdale Harris opened the door before I knocked. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. "She made physical contact?" he asked, voice flat. "She lifted the ring," I said. "With both girls strapped in, pushed it off the deck." His jaw flexed. "That's not an HOA issue. That's a civilian felony." I handed him the packet, Ellis's folder, my footage key, the amended resolutions, and the digital timestamps. "She's trying to preemptively frame me," I said, "which means if I go through the board, I'll lose control of the timeline. I want it elevated. Child welfare, state oversight, HOA compliance division, every angle that puts this above neighborhood drama." "You sure?" he asked. I nodded once. "This isn't about revenge. It's about containment and precedent." Dell reached for the burner phone on the table and turned it on. "I'll get the file into state hands. We've got a caseworker flagged for Gold Star Family Alert. If the system works the way it should, her badge won't mean anything by the end of the week." It wouldn't be fast, but it would be real, the kind of pressure she couldn't manipulate. The first real break came from a frame-by-frame analysis of the security footage, my footage, not the HOA's tampered version. I had the stream mirrored to a personal server Mira and I built together the year before she died. It wasn't cloud-based, no third-party logins, no HOA access credentials, just raw data running through a local line under our crawl space, piped directly to a vault partition on a physical drive. I had reviewed the incident a dozen times already. I'd seen Verla's hand shove the float. I'd seen the ripple from her shoe on the deck. But this time, I was watching for something else. At timestamp 14:02:11, just after the float slipped into the water, Verla turned. Her mouth moved, not toward me, toward the security post. The lifeguard on duty that day was a teenager, quiet, new to the neighborhood. I hadn't thought much of it until now. I zoomed in on Verla's face, enhanced. The camera caught enough of the angle to capture 2 distinct words. "Turn away." She said it. I could see the shape of her mouth, clear, measured, cold, and the guard did. At 14:02:12, his posture shifted. His eyes flicked from the pool to the clubhouse entrance. He turned his body, placing his back between the deck and the cameras inside. That wasn't negligence, that was instruction. I isolated the frame, extracted the clip, and stitched it to the report Dell had already begun routing through Vigilant Tide's internal chain. That word, instruction, changed everything. It elevated Verla's behavior from reckless to coordinated. And in child endangerment law, coordination carries weight. It was no longer just about what she did. It was about who followed and why. Later that afternoon, I pulled up the HOA Security Policy Manual. It had been uploaded in PDF format 6 months ago. Standard boilerplate, filled with community noise ordinances and vague safety policies. But buried on page 32 was the clause I needed. All Briarwatch Hollow personnel, including contracted security staff, must report unsafe or unusual incidents to the HOA president within 1 hour of occurrence. Deviation may result in termination. The lifeguard had every reason to obey her. I flagged the clause, highlighted the timestamp, and created a side-by-side comparison of policy versus footage. I didn't need him to testify. I just needed proof that her position enabled manipulation. That would trigger a secondary layer in the outside complaint process, one that would open up her leadership record to inspection by a state-appointed ombudsman. Once that was done, I drove out past the ridgeline to a patch of abandoned gravel off Route 6, where Dell and the Tide team kept their off-grid review rig. Nothing military, nothing illegal, just a quiet, privately owned diagnostic center for data syncing, powered by solar rigs and far enough outside any city zone to keep things discreet. Dell was already there when I arrived. I pulled her past HOA filings, he said, handing me a hard drive. You were right. The timestamp mismatch on her resolution uploads wasn't just sloppiness. It matches the same IP she used to issue 2 emergency warnings last quarter. Pattern of misrepresentation, I said, thumbing through the report. Pattern of coercive control, he corrected. That's the term the Ombudsman's office will use, and once the word's attached to her file, they'll lock her access to discretionary authority until the investigation's closed. That would mean no more last-minute policy changes, no more room to smear me with ambiguous rule enforcement, and no more hiding behind a badge. I'm going to give this one more day, I said. Let the report finish syncing, then I'll file it all at once. State HOA Compliance Division, Child Welfare, and Military Survivors Bureau. Dell gave a low nod. Good, just be ready. When this goes public, it's not going to stay quiet. I was counting on that. Verla had played her moves in the dark, using timing and confusion as cover, but I had her on tape, giving orders, lying on filings, manipulating the system she swore to uphold. And soon, every agency she thought would protect her was going to have a copy of the truth, frame by frame, word by word. The knock came just after sunset. Not a fist, knuckles, light, deliberate, almost polite. I already knew who it was. Alina Kress stood on my porch with her phone in one hand and her son's swim towel still looped over the other. She looked rattled, not scared, but like someone holding a match too close to her fingers. She's saying you shoved the float in yourself, Alina said. That you panicked when it drifted and blamed her to cover your mistake. I didn't answer right away. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't sit, just stood near the front window, watching the shadows ripple across the lake as if Verla's face might appear in the reflection. Her voice was sharp, but I could hear the tension behind it, anger tangled in guilt. My son was next to the railing, she said. He saw it. She walked up. She pushed it. He told me in the car before I could ask. I needed to look you in the eye before I said anything to anyone. I nodded. And now? I'll testify, if it comes to that. I didn't thank her. Not out of pride, just out of exhaustion. Gratitude would come later, after the girls were safe, after Verla was removed, after I could sit on the deck without bracing for war. She's been leaving flyers in mailboxes, Alina added, claiming you falsified ADA exemptions, that you threatened board members, that you're exploiting the sympathy of Gold Star status to manipulate policy. That last part hit harder than I expected. Mira didn't die so I could carry her memory like a shield. She died because the world doesn't stop for careful drivers or good mothers or kind nurses. And now someone was twisting that loss into a weapon. I walked to the safe behind the bookshelf, keyed in the code, pulled out the last piece of what I needed, the original Gold Star enrollment form, Mira's name, my designation, our daughters listed as qualified dependents under trauma recovery criteria, stamped, verified, digitally sealed. She had registered us herself, not because she feared dying, but because she planned for what it would mean if she did. I placed the file next to the footage, the witness notes, the board amendments, and the timestamp discrepancies. The folder was thick now, not just evidence, but architecture, structural collapse in written form. And then, for the first time since the push, I opened the closet where Mira kept her work gear. Folded inside one of her old hospital bags was the embroidered fabric pouch she used for emergencies. Inside were the medical tags she'd made for the float rings, laminated, color-coded, waterproof. Each one listed the girl's oxygen saturation history neonatal complications, and the float design specs she'd researched herself. I'd never even realized she finished them. I added them to the folder. I wasn't just filing a complaint anymore. I was delivering a case, the kind that would reach across jurisdictions and lock down more than one agency. Dell had already prepped the routing. We'd submit to the state HOA compliance division first, triggering a freeze on discretionary leadership power. Then child welfare, based on coordinated endangerment and deliberate obstruction. Finally, the Military Survivors Bureau, leveraging Mira's designation and the embedded protections therein. Each one was a circuit breaker, and if Verla tried to override one, the other two would trip. Alina left quietly after that. No dramatic promises, no shaky farewells, just a nod. The girls woke briefly around 9. I held them on the porch as they drifted back to sleep, wrapped in a blanket Mira's sister had sent from Colorado. The sky above the lake was cloudless, except for the flicker of a commercial plane cutting silently through the stars. I knew I wasn't done. There were still final steps to prepare. But for the first time since the clover deck went quiet, I wasn't reacting. I was moving. And by this time tomorrow, Verla Drench would no longer be the one deciding what happened next. Ellis didn't speak when he entered. He just placed a sealed envelope on my kitchen table and stood there, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets like he didn't trust them to stay steady. The silence stretched between us, thick with whatever war had been turning in his gut since the pool incident. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things. A signed witness statement detailing Verla's actions at the pool, what he saw, what she said, what the lifeguard failed to do, and a copy of a resignation letter. Not his, hers. She typed that 3 days ago, he said quietly, after the first round of complaints came in, but she never submitted it. She wanted to hold it, see if the pressure went away. I looked up. You took this from her? I found it on her desk. She asked me to proof it, said she was having doubts about how things were unfolding. I made a copy before she could shred it. It wasn't legal leverage, not by itself, but it was narrative ammunition, a crack in her mask. Even Verla knew what she did couldn't be spun forever. She's scared, Ellis added. Not enough to stop, but enough to start hedging. I slid the statement into the report packet and nodded. Then we move. Ellis stayed longer than I expected, sat at the table while my daughters played in the next room, their voices drifting through the hallway in soft bursts. He watched them for a while, something shifting in his face. Not guilt, something closer to reckoning. She almost killed them, he finally said. And I let it build to that point. I knew what she was doing with policy. I just kept telling myself it wasn't my lane. It became your lane the moment she weaponized your silence. He didn't argue. Later that night, I added his statement to the evidence folder. Every piece was now lined up. The footage, timestamp overlays, HOA charter violations, policy amendments, verbal instructions caught on video, the digital logs, Mira's enrollment packet, the float ring medical tags, and now a direct witness willing to stand behind it all. The architecture was complete. But before I filed, I made one more call. Dell picked up on the second ring. You ready? I want one final scan, I said. Cross-check her past 7 months of emergency policy changes against HOA state reporting requirements. Look for patterns. I need to know if this is just her, or if she's done this to other families before us. There was a pause, then, already started. I'll get you the logs before sunrise. I knew Dell well enough to believe him. The next morning, the results came in. 3 other families, all military or first responder households, all with children under 5. Each had received escalating citations, silent policy infractions, or verbal threats tied to noise disturbance or visual interference. One had quietly moved out. Another had been blocked from renewing their clubhouse lease. The last had filed a complaint that mysteriously vanished from the public HOA archive. Verla had a pattern. I attached all 3 cases as appendices to my formal filing, and then, at 8:13 a.m., I hit send. The report went out to 3 destinations: the State HOA Compliance Division, the Department of Child Welfare's Family Endangerment Intake, and the Office of Military Survivor Protection, Mira's office in another life. By 9:04 a.m., I had confirmation receipts from 2 of the 3, By noon, the HOA website displayed a red banner at the top of its homepage. Leadership under state review. All facility enforcement suspended pending audit. Verla hadn't responded publicly yet. I knew she would. She wouldn't go quiet, not after years of wielding unchecked authority. But the shield she used to hide behind, procedure, position, policy, that shield was cracking. And for the first time since we'd moved to Briarwatch Hollow, the rules were no longer hers to twist. By morning, the gates at Briarwatch Hollow had changed. The usual smugness that hung over the community like fog was thinning. Residents didn't wave. They watched. Some glanced down quickly when I passed. Others didn't bother hiding their stares. Something had shifted in the air, and they felt it. I walked the perimeter like I used to walk the wire back on base. Slow, observant, cataloging weak points. Except this time, it wasn't fences or gates I was checking. It was people, reactions, movement, the silence between phrases when neighbors exchanged updates, the tightening of shoulders when I appeared. A few leaned closer to each other, whispering things that never left their mouths the week before. The audit notice had landed hard. Verla's name wasn't on it, not directly. But the implication was loud. The HOA board was under review, and all enforcement privileges were paused. That meant no fines, no pool suspensions, no clubhouse restrictions, no anonymous citations. It meant her teeth had been pulled, and she was going to bite anyway. Just after noon, a memo hit the community email chain. Subject line, Community Clarification, Recent Disruptions. It was a masterclass in indirect accusation. A concerned resident had raised allegations regarding a misunderstood safety enforcement, and Verla claimed her ongoing cooperation with state authorities as proof of transparency. No names, no confessions, just vague phrasing soaked in misdirection. I flagged the message and sent it to Dell. His reply was immediate. She's testing optics, trying to reclaim narrative. Don't respond directly. I didn't. I had a better plan. At 2:15 p.m., I entered the community clubhouse for the first time in weeks. The door, usually locked to my access badge, slid open without resistance. State audit protocol had forced it into default status, equal entry for all residents. A few people were already inside. Most avoided eye contact. One elderly man gave me a quiet nod. Another mother shifted in her seat to form a silent barrier between me and her toddler. I wasn't offended. I was expected. I moved to the bulletin board near the pool scheduling station, removed the laminated Serenity Zone plaque Verla had installed. Taped in its place was a single sheet of paper, pending state review, all prior restrictions null until further notice, by Order of Commonwealth Housing Oversight Division. That wasn't defiance. That was compliance, the kind Verla could no longer manipulate. I made sure the font matched the original signage. I made sure it looked clean, official, orderly, no chaos, just correction. That night, I called Ellis. She's preparing a statement, he said before I could ask. She's going to hold an emergency board gathering, off record. Says it's just a discussion session for residents who want to process the stress. She's trying to reestablish presence, spin fear into sympathy. She wants to make you the story, Ellis said, not the facts, the man, the widow, the unstable veteran. She'll wrap it in careful language, but that's the shape it'll take. She still thinks this ends in conversation, I said. It doesn't. No, I agreed. It ends in confrontation. Ellis paused. I'll be there. When it happens, I'll speak. He didn't owe me that, but I knew what it cost him to say it anyway. Later that night, I finished assembling the final visual timeline, not just reports and statements, a linear, clean breakdown. Every action Verla took, in order, every timestamp, every reaction. I added silent video frames, quotes from her memos, and excerpts from her denied exemptions. I printed 25 copies, bound, indexed, numbered. The next board session was still 3 days away. But by then, Verla wouldn't be able to claim this was personal. She wouldn't be able to hide behind confusion. And she damn sure wouldn't be able to act like no one remembered what she did on the deck that day. The morning of the prep meeting, I packed everything with surgical precision. One waterproof binder containing all original evidence, camera footage stills, Verla's verbal command frame, timestamp overlays, Ellis's statement, the float ring medical tags, Mira's gold star packet, HOA policy mismatches, and her unsigned resignation. 25 bound copies of the timeline document I printed the night before, and one thumb drive encrypted with the full audit trail, sealed in a metal case and chained to my wrist. I wasn't planning for a meeting. I was preparing for battle. At 11 a.m., I drove to Dell's off-grid command shed. By the time I arrived, 2 other members from Vigilant Tide were already there, Cal Weaver and Marcus Elton, both former trauma containment officers, both fathers. Dell was waiting outside the rig. He didn't waste words. She tried to push a secondary narrative through a local community blogger, he said, handing me a printed post. Claimed she'd stepped in to assist when she saw your girls drifting. She's implying she saved them. I scanned the post, a few lines of sanitized fiction wrapped in passive language. No direct blame, just carefully placed implications, doubt without outright denial. She doesn't think the footage exists, I said, or she thinks it won't matter. I handed him the drive. Make it matter. He nodded and slid it into his tablet. The screen lit up with a mosaic of time-coded entries, frame captures, log snippets, and motion-tracked overlays. Everything was aligned. Every second accounted for. Every action documented. She won't be able to pivot once this goes public, Dell said, but you'll need to hold frame. They'll try to bait you. I know. She's calling it a mediation, but it's going to be a stage theater. She'll fill the room with plants, sympathetic residents, HOA loyalists, people she's helped with fine reductions or community favors. You walk in alone, you're the aggressor. I won't walk in alone. Dell raised a brow. Who else? I looked past him toward the end of the gravel path. Ellis was walking up, dressed in civilian black, folder under one arm, face set like stone. Behind him trailed Alina Crest, her son holding her hand, eyes wide but determined, and behind them, 2 other neighbors I hadn't expected. Jason Morell, who ran logistics for the seasonal garage sales, and Maggie Wren, who led the community garden committee. I hadn't called them, but they came anyway. Dell gave me a thin smile. Guess you're not walking in alone after all. We spent the next 2 hours prepping, reviewing legal framing, state compliance responses, how to introduce the material without giving Verla a single rhetorical inch. We rehearsed how Ellis would deliver his statement, how Alina would describe her son's eyewitness account, how Jason and Maggie would confirm the pattern of harassment they had witnessed over the past year. Each piece was part of a coordinated strategy. The goal wasn't to win an argument, it was to detonate a narrative. By the time we broke, I felt the rhythm of it settle into my spine. I wasn't running defense anymore. I was shaping the terrain. Verla didn't know it yet, but she had already lost control. She just hadn't seen how deeply the floor beneath her had shifted. That evening, I returned home and found my daughters asleep on the living room carpet, surrounded by building blocks and stuffed animals. The camo float rings sat propped in the corner, still damp from their bath earlier. I stood there for a long while, just watching them breathe. Then I opened my laptop and made the final update to the submission packet. I added a single line to the top of the timeline summary, bold and centered. This is not a grievance. This is a reckoning. Tomorrow, Verla would face the one thing she couldn't manipulate, intimidate, or silence. A room full of truth. The room was already half full when I walked in. Fold-out chairs lined the perimeter of the community center's multi-purpose hall. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, humming louder than the murmurs floating between residents. Some clutched HOA handbooks. Others leaned in pairs, whispering with the vague discomfort of people unsure which way the wind would blow. Verla Drench stood near the front, flanked by 2 board members I didn't recognize, both new, both silent. She wore her usual navy windbreaker, and that practiced expression she passed off as calm authority. But I noticed the white at her knuckles, where her fingers curled around her binder. She hadn't expected me to show. Ellis arrived just after me, walking in alone, but with the slow, even steps of a man who had finally decided what side he was on. He didn't look at her, didn't greet anyone, just took a chair 3 rows back and opened his own folder. Alina came next, holding her son's hand tightly. He clutched a drawing, a mess of color, shaped vaguely like a pool, 2 small blobs floating on blue. She sat beside Ellis without a word. Dell entered last. He wore civilian clothes but moved like military, straight back, clean stride. The room adjusted when he passed through it, as if the air itself leaned to listen. He didn't sit. He stood at the back wall, arms crossed, silent and still. Verla cleared her throat. "Thank you, everyone, for joining on short notice. This isn't a formal board meeting. This is a community discussion meant to clarify a series of misunderstandings that have, unfortunately, attracted outside interference." She smiled, just a little. "I ask that we keep things civil, measured, respectful." I stepped forward. No microphone, no podium, just my voice. "I've brought documentation for every resident in this room. A chronological account of what happened 3 days ago, including video stills, time-stamped policy infractions, and the full statement from Dr. Ellis Ventro, who witnessed the incident directly." I passed the first set to Maggie, who began quietly distributing them, row by row. Verla's eyes narrowed. "Commander Maddox, I'd remind you that this space is not designated for confrontation." "This isn't confrontation," I said, cutting her off without raising my voice. "It's correction." I held up my copy, the timeline, the report, the truth. "You pushed both of my daughters into that pool. You instructed a minor to turn his back. You altered timestamp entries on HOA records and filed 2 amendments outside authorized board hours. You denied ADA exemptions legally filed under state law, and you attempted to frame me for negligence to justify it." Gasps didn't echo. They just fell like glass in a carpeted room. Small, muffled, dangerous. Verla stepped forward, trying to regain posture. "I acted under my authority to ensure safety and visual compliance." "You committed felony endangerment," I said. "And the State Compliance Division has already opened a formal investigation. That banner on the website wasn't a courtesy. It was a lockdown." Ellis rose from his seat, holding up his signed statement. I saw her push the float. I saw her turn to the lifeguard and say, "Turn away." "That's not policy enforcement. That's concealment." Alina followed. "My son saw it too. He drew what he saw. He said, 'The lady pushed them.'" She held up the crayon-scrawled drawing. It looked like nothing and everything at once. Verla tried to speak, but Dell took 1 step forward, and her mouth closed. He didn't say a word. He just held up a flash drive. "I've submitted everything," I said, returning to the center. "To the state, to the Child Welfare Division, and to the Office of Military Survivor Protection. All of it. Footage, falsified amendments, verbal instructions. You're not under review, Verla. You're under audit. And after that comes liability." The room was silent. No, whispering now. No mutters, just the collective stillness of a community watching the fall of someone they thought couldn't be touched. Verla took a step back, and for the first time since we moved here, I saw fear in her eyes. Verla didn't speak again. She stepped back from the center of the room, set her binder on the table like it suddenly weighed too much, and folded her arms tightly across her chest. The corners of her mouth twitched once, twice, like she was calculating the odds of clawing back control and realizing the math wouldn't save her. The silence stretched. Then Jason Morrell, the usually quiet logistics coordinator, stood up. "I got 3 citations last fall," he said, holding up a folded stack of papers, "each one for leaving a folding chair on my front lawn for more than 24 hours. She said it violated curb aesthetics, but the chair was for my father. He's recovering from spinal surgery. I filed an appeal, never got a response. Turns out, none of them were logged." More heads turned, more hands lifted. Maggie Wren stood next. She blocked the irrigation access to the garden after I told her it was a community mental health project, said it made the neighborhood look cluttered. "I've had 3 therapy clients in tears this month because they can't visit it anymore." The room began to shift in shape, once divided by silence, now forming a center of gravity around the truth. Not just my truth, everyone's. And Verla stood in the eye of it, realizing the wind wasn't moving in her favor anymore. I opened the timeline binder and flipped to the final page. "This is the audio still," I said, holding up the blown-up frame. Verla instructing the lifeguard to turn away, time-stamped, synced with the HOA's own motion log. It matches the server response pinged down to the millisecond. The guard's affidavit was filed with the state this morning. I let that settle before continuing. The Gold Star Family Protection Protocol was activated under full federal compliance. I didn't hack into anything. I didn't call in favors. I followed the rules, exactly as written, and the system responded because it recognized what this was: targeted abuse, disguised as policy. Verla took a breath like she was preparing to speak, but Ellis stood and beat her to it. "She told me she regretted not restricting the deck earlier," he said, voice steady but stripped of warmth. "She called the float rings grief props. Said if she didn't act, more families would start bringing in memorialized gear. And she didn't want to turn Briarwatch into what she called a gallery of trauma." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I should have spoken sooner. I should have pushed back when she first denied the exemption request. But I was afraid of what she'd do, of what she'd threatened to take." He looked at me when he said the next part. "But fear doesn't justify silence, not when kids are involved." I nodded once. Then, from the back, Dell walked forward and handed me a packet, freshly printed, clipped at the corner. "State Compliance issued their response an hour ago," he said. "Verla Drench's authority as board president is officially suspended, pending full investigation. A temporary mediator has been appointed by the Ombudsman's office to oversee all HOA functions until the audit concludes." He didn't look at her, just spoke it into the room. And the room responded. It didn't erupt, not with cheers or applause, but something changed, like someone had opened a window and let the air back in. Shoulders dropped, breath returned. Residents began turning to each other, speaking without hushed tones, names exchanged like they hadn't been in months. Verla lowered herself into the nearest chair. For the first time, she didn't try to correct the narrative. She just sat there, hands limp in her lap, while her kingdom slowly folded in on itself. As I stepped outside into the cold air, Ellis caught up to me. "You did it," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "She did it to herself. I just stopped pretending not to see." The wind rolled across the lake. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime struck once, clear and hollow. Tomorrow, the paperwork would finalize. The investigation would begin. But today, the fear had shifted. And for once, it wasn't mine. The next morning, I woke to the sound of quiet. Not the thin, brittle silence that followed fear, but the kind that meant something had finally broken. For the first time since Mira died, I didn't feel like the world was conspiring to test what little I had left. I just heard the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of settling wood, and 2 small breaths from the room down the hall. The twins were still asleep when I stepped outside. The air over the lake was silvered with mist. Dew clung to the planks of the clover deck, the same ones Verla had tried to rebrand into her Serenity Zone. The caution tape was gone. The state investigator had cleared it the night before, marking it as a public family use area again. I could almost hear Mira laughing at the irony, how her handmade float rings had sparked a statewide audit. By noon, the formal statement dropped. Commonwealth of Virginia, Office of Housing Oversight. Verla Drench was removed from her position, banned from serving on any HOA board within state jurisdiction for a minimum of 10 years. The final audit summary cited patterned endangerment of minors, document falsification, and abuse of executive authority under false pretense. Her photograph came down from the bulletin board before sunset. Ellis took it off himself. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The weight in his shoulders had changed. The man who'd once stood frozen at the pool's edge now moved like someone who'd finally remembered how to breathe. The rest of the board resigned within 48 hours. A state-appointed mediator named Rhonda Greer took over temporarily, former child safety investigator turned policy reformer. She visited me that evening with a clipboard and calm eyes that carried both professionalism and something close to empathy. "Commander Maddox," she said, "you've done more than file a complaint. You've just changed how HOAs in this county operate." Her tone wasn't congratulatory. It was factual. "The footage and evidence you submitted created new procedural language. Any HOA near a military or survivor community must now submit their amendments to a live oversight review, effective immediately." I thanked her, but the words felt mechanical. It wasn't pride I felt. It was gravity, the kind that follows when justice finally lands after falling for too long. That night, we gathered by the pool, not for ceremony, just for closure. Ellis, Alina, Jason, Maggie, a few others. The twins wore their matching float rings, now resewn with new patches stitched by Alina herself. Small golden anchors, one on each side. I lowered them into the shallow end, keeping my hands under the rings the entire time. Their laughter filled the air like sunlight. For a few seconds, it was almost as if Mira was there too. When they splashed me, I didn't even flinch. I let it happen, let the water soak through the collar of my shirt and settle cold against my skin. Because this time, the water wasn't something to fear. It was proof that what had been taken could be reclaimed. Ellis stood near the gate and spoke quietly. "The ombudsman wants to name this deck after Mira." I looked over. "She wouldn't have wanted that." He nodded. "Then what would she want?" I smiled faintly. "Something simple, something for the kids." 2 weeks later, the plaque was installed at the edge of the deck. The Halcyon Ring. In memory of all who protect peace at home. No name, no drama, just legacy. By spring, the HOA had voted to rebrand itself under new leadership. They implemented new bylaws requiring family consultation for any safety-related decisions. Every parent now had a voice in the policies that shaped their homes. And for the first time since the neighborhood's founding, the pool was full of children's laughter on weekends. I still keep the original flash drive locked away. Not as a weapon, just as a reminder of what silence costs, of what speaking up restores. Some nights, when the twins are asleep, I sit on the porch and look out toward the clover deck. The air smells like wet pine and freedom. And I think about how one act of cruelty started a chain reaction that ended with something stronger than revenge, change. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't fight louder. It's make sure they can never hurt anyone the same way again. If you've ever stood up to power that thought it owned you, if you've ever been told to be quiet and refused, then you know what this story really is. It's not about one HOA. It's about every person who ever said, enough. Where are you watching from tonight?